This represents the culmination of a lot of technical topics and important topics and a lot of substance and meat. So before we move into the next piece, which is critical, as this is, let's just level set. Let's go back to the beginning and let's just walk through and think about how we got here and why. Because again, this isn't just for the purposes of learning something for the sake of learning something, although if that's why you're here, congratulations. But this is about truly obtaining insight and understanding into what's happening in this startup, venture capital, seed deal world. So at the very start, we have a startup, and then eventually that startup is going to raise venture capital. Probably a product-based company, probably tech, biotech, life sciences, intellectual property is involved. Eventually it's going to reach a point of maturation where traditional venture capital, institutional investors are going to be interested in investing and putting money to work in this company through a Series A financing and then a Series B, C, and D, so on and so forth. Ultimately the company exits. But to get from this point of just raw ideation and hope to this point of venture capital, there's a stage. And the stage is where the seed deal takes place. And the seed deal represents the money, the water. The water is the seeds, the cash that's invested in these startups during this period of time. This period of time may be non-existent in the very rare case that a startup is able to skip a grade and go straight from startup to venture capital, but 99% of the time, your startup is going to experience a seed deal. This could be a 2-week period, it could be a 2-year period, it could be a 6-year period, okay? Every company is different, every circumstance is different. But this is what we're talking about, the seed deal. Now, people start companies for lots of reasons. We've talked about a number of those through the course of this episode. They start companies because there's a scientific problem they want to solve. There's a technological riddle that they want to unlock. There's a product they want to build. There's a market they want to access. They want to create a legacy. They want to build culture. These are all the right reasons to start a company. But there's also nothing wrong with wanting to cash a check. And when do you cash a check? Well, maybe your company goes public. Maybe you have an initial public offering, an IPO, where you're selling shares to the public, and which then gives you the later opportunity as a founder to sell your shares to everyday investors. But for most startups, 99%, to use that number again, of startups, they're going to achieve that moment through an M&A transaction. Stands for mergers and acquisitions. It's an exit event, an exit transaction, a liquidity event. This is when they cash out. This is when we take the balance sheet, which looks like this. Assets on the left, liabilities over equity on the right. We flip it, assets equals liabilities plus equity, move it around a little more, assets minus liabilities equals equity. We take the good stuff, those are gross proceeds. We pay off the bad stuff, our liabilities, what's left, the net proceeds, that gets distributed to our owners. That's the moment of truth. That's the transcendent opportunity that our founders, our employees with an ownership interest, our investors with an ownership interest, this is what they've been working towards. Net proceeds. How do we know how to allocate the net proceeds? The cap table, short for capitalization table. That's our roadmap. The shares, those numbers which tell us how many nuts and berries we've got, whether it's 6 or 6 million, those shares translate into ownership percentages. Those ownership percentages we map onto the net proceeds to tell us who gets what in an exit moment. That's why the cap table is so important. It's critical. It's why it must be kept up to date and be precise and transparent and complete. That's the cap table. Now on the cap table, there's a column for shares, and we broke that down. There are 2 classes of shares. Common shares, these get awarded to people for services, including the founders. Preferred shares, that's what investors buy. They buy preferred shares. When we talked about preferred shares, we said, well, if investors are seeking preferred shares, if they want preferred shares, why? Well, control reasons and governance reasons, and we talked about at the level of ownership, at the level of being a stockholder, they have these things called protective provisions, which are blocking rights or veto rights or negative covenants, where it says the corporation can't do certain things without the specific approval of the preferred stockholders. And generally speaking, these are limited to highly meta, very macro, very material, very existential, very organic, high-level things. sale of the company, raising money, that sort of stuff. We also talked about how preferred stockholders will frequently seek the right to designate a member of the board of directors, because that way, on a day-to-day basis, they have the ability to have insight into what's happening. What's happening with the strategy of the company? What sort of choices are being made? What sort of dialogue is taking place at the C level, among the founders and other management team members? They get access to that by virtue of being on the board. So preferred stockholders are going to seek those attributes, seek those benefits and privileges. It's part of the reason why they want preferred shares rather than just common shares. Those extra rights would be embedded within the preferred shares. Then finally, we talked about the economic advantages that are associated with preferred shares over common shares. And here we talked about the liquidation preference. It's reflected as a multiple of purchase price or the original issue price. It's almost always 1x, which means 1 times the purchase price. Gives you a chance to get your money back. Well, how does that work? When do you get your money back? Well, in liquidation. Well, what's liquidation? Well, there's bad liquidation when we don't have many net proceeds, if any, but there's good liquidation, but there's a ton of net proceeds. So it's your sale of the company. It's a critical event, very important. And then we talked about finally that there are 2 categories of preferred shares. There's participating preferred, which is designated by an and there's non-participating preferred, which is designated by an or. In the case of non-participating preferred, it looks like common, it tastes like common, it plays like common in an upside liquidation scenario. They get their pro rata share of the net proceeds, period. They own a third of the preferred stockholders, own a third of the company, they get a third of the net proceeds. Just like common. 1-to-1, everybody's on the same team, wearing the same jersey, same rights. But what if it's a downside scenario? What if they wouldn't get their money back by virtue of just getting their pro rata share of the net proceeds? Well, they have a chance to get their money back ahead of the common shareholders. That's when the liquidation preference plays. So for non-participating preferred, the economic benefit comes in a downside scenario, but not in an upside scenario. With participating preferred, it's both. They get it both, always. They get their money back, their liquidation preference, and they get their pro rata of the net proceeds, always. Bad liquidation, good liquidation. They get their money back and they get percentage of what's left, just like common. Non-participating preferred is more typical, it's more market, but participating preferred exists, and as we discussed, it's something to be negotiated and considered within the whole cloth of a transaction. Many people frown upon it, but it's important to be aware of it. It's important to understand how it works. And it's also important not to reject it like anything out of hand. You understand it, that gives you the ability to negotiate against it or for it, and to understand it and deal with it within the context of your transaction. That brings us up to where we move from here, which is how we actually sell preferred stock. We know what it is, we know why investors want it, now we need to figure out how to sell it. And when you talk about how to sell it, that means we have to figure out how to price it. And that's where we move to next.